Madam Clerk? The time is 5 o'clock p.m., and I officially call the Richland County Development and Services Committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Pugh. Teratio.
Here.
Barron.
Here.
English.
Present.
Newton.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. The next item of business is the approval of the minutes.
Move to approve.
Second.
Any comments, additions, or changes? Hearing none, it's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Teratio.
Yes.
Barron.
Yes.
English.
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. And you can hear her, but I'll just acknowledge that Councilwoman Barron had previously notified both the committee and the chair that she would be attending virtually, and she is joining us by Zoom today as a committee member. Item 3 is the adoption of the agenda. Mr. Administrator or Mr. Attorney, any additions or changes?
No requested changes.
Thank you. With that, I'll entertain a motion.
Move to.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Move to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Teratio.
Yes.
Barron.
Yes.
English. Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. We have one item for action, which is a carryover from our last committee meeting. It is item 4A, Department of Public Works Engineering Division Traffic Calming Policy. You have updates in your agenda on pages 10 through 28. I will note that at our last committee meeting, we asked that if any council members had questions, if they would direct them to the department. Those questions have been answered and are provided in your packet on the referenced pages. With that, Mr. Administrator, is there anyone on your team who wants to briefly address this item before any committee discussion?
We have County Engineer Shawnie Fuller, who will brief you just on this matter.
Good evening.
Thank you. You're recognized, Ms. Fuller.
Thank you. Speeding complaints are one of the largest complaints that we get at Public Works. Ironically, it's a close second to complaints for roads, for repairs. So we've had this policy in place as an internal policy, best we can tell, going back about 10 years. But we could not, during our research period, find where we had brought it before council to be adopted. So that's what we're asking for now, is just an acknowledgement of the policy to answer any questions, and also so that it could become a public reference.
Thank you. And I think I mentioned this last time. I learned quite a bit about traffic calming. I thought that there were only speed bumps, but lo and behold, there were many items, and I thought that it was a very comprehensive report. Again, for the record, would you briefly describe for the public what you see as some of the key changes in terms of how we would be operating by officially adopting this policy versus how we may have operated in the past?
Sure. The only major change that we're looking for is previously we had done the traffic studies, so a resident may call in, make the request, we would put them on a list, and then first come, first serve. We would go out, we would do the traffic study, then we would analyze the data from that. Oftentimes what we're finding, though, is that maybe only 10% are legitimate speeding complaints that meet all the criteria for placement. So what we're looking for is to move the petition, which is to show the community support from the neighborhood, to the top. So now you could call, you can get on the list for like a review. So we would do maybe a desktop review or possibly a field review to make sure that there is a possible place to install something. Once we've determined that all the geometry and the safety issues have been reviewed, we would put you on the list to fill out a petition. So we would designate a petition area based on where we believe the traffic calming device should be. then the community would fill out the petition. Once you have the support, then you move to the next step in the process, which would be that you can get the
Attorney
traffic study
on
done.
that, but I mean, we could definitely assist them on it.
So there's an offer of assistance from the wider universe with our traffic study. And so then I would just ask this question and then let our council members ask questions. So my understanding is that part of the intent for making this change is that right now, our list of communities who want speed humps is so long, but then they don't always get them at the end. The hope is that with this, we can speed the process of getting them information and just make it a faster and more efficient process. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's also the aspect of resources. So this is not a full-time job. It is a portion of someone's job. So we are limited in the amount of time that we can spend on these. So right now, we're kind of spending time and resources when we don't actually have roads that meet the criteria to even have the placement for a calming device.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments from the committee?
I have one, but question.
Well, someone has it, so Ms. English, you're recognized.
I'm at the traffic study versus the petition, and I'm thinking a lot of times the traffic study doesn't capture what the residents really capture, those that live in that area. So I kind of answered my own question.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions about the traffic calming procedure? Is that a no? Then with that, I'll entertain a motion.
Move to approve. Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, will you call for the vote to forward the Department of Public Works traffic calming policy to full council for approval?
Teratio,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
English,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. That brings us to the lengthiest part of our agenda for today, which are items pending analysis where no action is required. Item 5A, I move to direct the administrator to conduct a review of the rank weeds and vegetation ordinance and recommend any updates that would improve the effectiveness of the ordinance, particularly as it relates to safety, enforcement, and blight reduction. That is on page 29 of our agenda. I'm scrolling to. And then the update that we have here is that in September, staff estimates that they'll be able to bring amendments to us for review. And part of the reasons on the timeline of this is that it is a complicated ordinance and that we also have a lot of staff engagement right now with the Land Development Code, making sure that we get that understood and adopted by the public. Are there any questions about this motion or any comments that staff would like to add?
Just very briefly, Madam Chair, assuming that ACA Jensen has no additional comments, the only thing I would add is as you consider this particular ordinance, one of the things we want you to be aware of is that it looks like this particular enforcement mechanisms may be one similar that we went down before, where we need to really talk about what steps do we feel are going to be appropriate when people don't necessarily meet the criteria that are outlined for this particular code compliance. We may find out that our current process is not maybe prohibitive enough or does not allow for enough encouragement for folks to be compliant. So I just want you to kind of consider that as you really go through this process and think about when staff gets ready to present something, if you can provide input along the way to talk about, how the penalties that are currently in place either meet or fail to meet the level of encouragement that we think should be there, similar to what we did maybe with the other ordinances that we recently addressed, so that there's better compliance in these areas. One of the things that the brief points out is that this is not a criminal issue, so many times it's a civil issue, and as a result of that, when that goes to a civil process, we find some of our processes, citizens feel as though they go to the system, it's longer than they wanted to take, and maybe we're not moving fast enough. So again, those are some of the things I'm asking you all to consider as you think about what type of input that you might want in terms of an enforcement mechanism to make failure to comply with the code related to this, again, more encouraging for folks to be compliant.
Thank you. My question in response, Mr. Brown, is right now we're in April, almost May. We're not looking at having feedback come back to us until September. So is there any additional documentation or any other information that you want to provide this body to react to during that time period? Or is that just something that you're raising for us to consider when it comes back in September?
Yeah, I guess we could really point and highlight what the penalties look like as it relates to failure to comply, to see whether or not you feel like that's enough. The initial review by staff simply pointed out that some of the best practices are reflected in the current ordinance. So if we're not getting the level of compliance that we want from the current ordinance, then maybe there should be some, again, more improved encouragement. So I don't have anything to provide to you now, but I wanted to just kind of kick that off so that as you're thinking about what do I want to do with this ordinance, you would have that as a focus point and not just be waiting on what staff may provide to you by way of changes.
Would it be appropriate, you mentioned some best practices, you mentioned, other options. Would it be appropriate perhaps for a future version of this briefing document to outline what some of those options are as just food for thought as we think about it?
That makes sense. Yes, ma'am, we could do that.
Okay, is that something that you would require a motion for or something that staff could just add as an update?
No, ma'am, I have members who are taking notes right now, so we'll understand that as a next iteration of a follow-up to this, that to include that as next steps or as an additional briefing before we get to an actual changed proposed ordinance change.
And then one question, and I know that, well, I don't know. I don't think that you are psychic. If you are, please, let me know. But at the State House, there's legislation right now that is currently being considered that would allow, in the cases of nuisance, for counties to add penalties to property tax rolls, which I would see as one of those further inducements for compliance. If there are other developments like that haven't been mentioned, then that would be something that might be helpful for our consideration as well.
Thank you. And I will just point out that one of our own internally, where two of our own actually worked on submitting and drafting some language associated with that. So we are definitely in support of that as an option for improved encouragement to comply with the code.
Thank you. I know I've talked to my State House representatives and they've assured me they're on board as well. Want to make sure that we open the floor. Are there any other comments from the body regarding item 5A for the rank weeds vegetation ordinance? Hearing none, that brings us to item number 2, or rather 5B, direct the administrator to create regulations for the operation of short-term rentals in unincorporated Richland County. Those regulations would be listed as an amendment to the current ordinance relating to residential rental property regulations, similar to the absentee landlord ordinance that is currently being considered. Consideration should be given to licensing safety measures, number of occupants allowed, effects on infrastructure such as sewer and water, EMS and law enforcement potential response, and not having them create a nuisance in the neighborhood. And with the body's permission, item 5C has a similar response, so I will read that into the record as well. Direct the county administrator to work with staff to ensure the proposed short-term rental ordinance requires each homeowner who wishes to provide short-term rentals to obtain a business license and pay accommodations taxes. And I would ask for staff to just comment on that so you can have a variety of voices in our meeting today.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that brief sidebar conversation with ACA Jensen, who's going to initially brief the committee, and then we'll actually have another member of administration also provide some additional feedback.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Much appreciated. ACA Jensen for the record. Very briefly, I have asked our Business Service Center manager, Mr. Zach Kavanaugh, to lead the effort to prepare the short-term rental ordinance that we're proposing. He has been meeting and coordinating with the City of Columbia on the drafting of their ordinance so that hopefully we will bring back an ordinance before you that is similar in nature that will, so that folks who have short-term rentals both in the city and in the county will have some familiarity. It won't be a shocking difference between the two. Hopefully they will actually work hand in hand. So I'm going to give 2 seconds, if I may, Madam Chair, to Mr. Kavanaugh to tell you where we are in the process.
Please, thank you. Mr. Kavanaugh, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Zach Kavanaugh, Business Service Center. Thank you, Mr. Jensen. So, like Mr. Jensen mentioned, I have been working with the City of Columbia's legal division and also their Community Planning and Development Department to discuss some items in their current ordinance, which was passed a few weeks ago, that may translate over to our county, right? So I'm in the process of reviewing that with our legal department. I expect to have a presentation in front of this committee by next month.
Thank you. And then for my information, and I understand why we're operating somewhat in parallel with the City of Columbia and also fully cognizant of the legislation at the State House and what those limitations are, do we happen to know if some of the other municipalities within Richland County also have short-term licensing, whether it's the town of Blythewood or Irmo or Forest Acres or others?
Right, so I am not aware of any other short-term rental ordinance in any other neighboring jurisdiction within the county. I attended a webinar last week with the town of Hilton Head hosting it, and they've been in the short-term rental game for a long time, so it's nothing new to them. So I learned some things from her. Her name is Barbara, who works in the business license division over there, and we may transfer some of that language over to our ordinance if we can deem applicable. But I think it would be nice to mirror what we can from the city's ordinance and then edit things that wouldn't be transferred over. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I want to recognize any of my colleagues who might have questions about either item 5B or 5C. Ms. Terratio, you're recognized, and then Ms. Barron.
Thank you, and I'll try to formulate my question in a way that is appropriate. So speaking of short-term rentals and actions at the State House, one of the other things that I have been made aware of in relation to short-term rentals and state law is around the possibility of, and this might be more of an A and F question, of the A tax associated with those rentals perhaps being utilized for affordable housing measures. So I don't know if we have anything to say about that. I just wanted to know if staff were kind of aware of that effort and if that could also be just kept in the back of our heads as we look towards these short-term rentals.
Yes, ma'am. I think you're referring to S284. So I'm aware that that's something that is being looked at, and we'll definitely keep you all up to speed. I know affordable housing has been a question of members of the body, and so any opportunities that come out of that, we will certainly let you know.
Thank you, and I'll just say, speaking of Hilton Head, I think it's the same senator from that area, so you're exactly right, they are very much on top of that matter.
Yes, they are. And one other thing I'd like to mention to the committee is that with the current legislation in the State House, it's basically a ban on bans. The City of Columbia did amend their ordinance, which passed, to not cap non-owner occupied short-term rentals. So there was a cap there, and so to kind of align their ordinance language with what may come out of the State House, they went ahead and removed that cap. I just wanted to make the committee aware of that.
That concludes your questions? Ms. Terratio?
Sorry, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Barron?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I don't necessarily have a question as much as I do just a statement, and that is, I think it's critically important that we do align our ordinance with those around us. And I like to often remind this body as well as full council that we are the capital county. So being the capital county, there may even be some measures that we need to step outside of what the city of Columbia or the town of Blythewood or others are doing and have them to align more so with us and we be more proactive and lead from the front. And I know that the city they already have theirs in place and it's a solid plan. And I was talking to the mayor just yesterday and applauded him for that effort. But I do think that there are some things that perhaps we can include in ours because we have 7 municipalities within it. So as we look, let's also, I love the idea that you are spending time with the Hilton Head people. They do it well. And if we can do that, would be doing exactly what I'm stating, leading from the front.
Right, and then, yeah, part of my presentation next month will have some information regarding what other jurisdictions within Richland County are doing, if anything. And we can use that as kind of a jumping off point and kind of start our discussion with that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Barron. And I was remiss at the top of our meeting for not recognizing 2 council colleagues who are not on this committee, but who are joining us. So that would be Councilman Don Weaver from District 6 and Councilman Jason Branham for District 1. And hoping that you feel free at any point to comment. I welcomed you in my heart, but now I'm doing it out loud. And while I'm welcoming, I'll also acknowledge our council chair, Overture Walker, and any other council members who might join us. So with that, I just have one last question as it relates to the notes in our packet, specifically for the pending action and deliverables. For May 23rd, it says presentation and discussion of the adopted City of Columbia ordinance. And I just want to confirm, does that mean you are only showing us their ordinance, or you are showing us their ordinance in addition to a proposed draft for a Richland County ordinance?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Zach Kavanaugh, Business Service Center again. We would show both. We would have a copy of the City of Columbia's ordinance, and then we would have a draft of our own.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hearing no other questions about those 2 items, it brings us to item 5D, direct the administrator to research and present to council current laws and benefits of enacting impact fees in Richland County. The purpose is to help reduce the tax burden on residents by not having to pay the complete cost of development in Richland County. You can see the briefing document for that item on page 32. Is there a staff member who wants to address this? Again, in our packet, it identifies that there is research that has begun and is ongoing, and the proposed timeline for bringing us information is September of this year. And boy, it's going to be a busy September with all of the things that are coming our way. Are there any additional comments that anyone would like to provide?
Just very briefly, Madam Chair, very briefly, a little bit more than 2 seconds, but still briefly. No, seriously, the initial review of this item, based off how impact fees can be used and what they can be used for, it looks like there are some limitations there. And so what I've talked to the staff internally about is while we're doing our own internal research, it may be important to the committee that you may also want to consider maybe some other, when I say other, not that we can't do it, other experts in this area, because from what we see, based on how impact fees can be used, it may not have a transformative value for us as we, I think, hope for. So that's just one of the things. Again, we have more time to deal with this, but that's just really an initial review. And so if there's other folks or other resources that you all have seen and been working with, and that we can make sure we're making the best use of the committee's time, I just wanted to kind of bring that up for our initial review related to impact fees, because I know it was a conversation that many folks were wanting to at least review and get a better understanding of.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Before I ask my questions, are there any questions from the committee? Councilwoman Barron?
Thank you. And I'd like to direct my question to Administrator Brown. When you speak of other resources or other people, programs, are you suggesting perhaps this is something that we need an outside consultant or an outside expert to work alongside staff to give us better results?
I do think it's something that's worthwhile in the sense that I know that I believe there's a thought that impact fees could be implemented and provide a resource to the county. And so I want to make sure that as we go through this process, we don't miss anything and it look as though it's not something that we just want to do because it's going to be more work. So I just want to make sure that it's a good, clean research and overview of what is possible and what the benefit to the county would be, pros versus cons, and make sure that we're all clear on what that looks like. So yes, ma'am, I am suggesting that additional resources external to the county may be appropriate related to this particular review and endeavor.
Ms. Newton, may I continue?
Please, you're asking my questions for me. Thank you.
And so with that, the experts, additional resources that are needed, is this something that you need prior to coming back to this body in September? I don't want to speak for you, but it would appear that it would give us more substance if we had an expert that worked alongside of our team before presenting anything back to this body, because it may be you'll give us something at a high level and then noting that you've already stated that there may be some limitations, we may want to do this now. I know it sounds like we may need a motion for some resources and such, but I just want to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly and provide you with the resources that you need.
Yes, ma'am. If I could clarify just briefly, my understanding is that the body on some level believes that impact fees may be a viable option for the county and they want them explored. And as a result of that, I'm saying that we want to make sure that staff does exactly what needs to be done in assessing that. And I believe that that requires external resources to the staff.
Thank you. And just one final thing, and this is a statement. I think that this is something that we want to, well, I'll speak for me. Someone who lives very close to Scout Motors, who does lots of development and zoning and rezoning. As we look forward to the next 3 to 7 years in development, it would be really great if we find that this is helpful and going to be profitable for the county, that we do, I'd encourage this body to really, let's push this forward, because I think that this is an excellent time to do so, because there is, I'm getting phone calls left and right from developers and everyone else who wants to come to Richland County. So if that is the case, this would be great for us to have something in hand to help foot the bill. That's just a statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Barron. Councilman Weaver?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Brown, the only thing I would add about development fees is it would be a shame if those revenues poured into the general fund with no specific purpose. Because what will happen is you'll have more fees going in the good times, the revenue will build up, then we have a recession. What I would suggest when staff does their research, let's find out how some other counties and some other governments do it. Because what would be smart, I think, smarter, would be to put those funds in some kind of, capital projects trust fund and eventually build it up. So when people are saying, well, how do we build this new school? How do we build this new fire station? Well, we take it from those revenues or the interest from those revenues and that offsets that cost. So the money should be there theoretically always. If we can keep future council's hands off it, that would be great.
Yes, sir. In the briefing document, the executive summary does say that it cannot be used for ongoing operations. Some of the limitations that we're referencing are referencing for specific uses, and that's kind of another area that we're finding out and pointing out. But what I think would be helpful is if beyond what we see and think we have found, if folks who deal in this very specifically could also articulate clearly what those utilizations are, and again, what the impacts look like for Richland County, again, positive and or negative, so that either in support of or beyond what my staff is able to provide, you have an independent, if you will, resource that speaks to you about that. So again, that kind of removes the what benefit is it for your administration to share this with you? You know, do we get something out of it? It just allows for a cleaner review of this matter.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Other questions, comments? Then, Mr. Brown, I would just add a thank you to my colleagues because they both asked and raised questions and concerns that I also have. And then to make sure that I'm clear from an administrative process, certainly you as administrator have certain things that fall under your purview where you're able to act and expend funds without council action. Am I to understand that you desire a motion specifically to empower you more or differently to bring in this resource?
I would like a motion because it specifically says that you believe that you want that done and you find it also to be either important or necessary. And then to the extent that the funding is beyond my threshold, and we find that out before the next time we can take this up with the body, that then it is something that could be reported out to the full council, and the authority could be given contingent upon if it exceeds my authority.
It's budget time, Mr. Brown. So thank you for clarifying that. And just let me state on the record as one of the co-signers for this motion that this is something that I think is important for all of Richland County as we look at fulfilling our goals of the strategic plan, where we're looking at having sustainable growth and smart growth, and certainly understanding the limitations that the state legislature may have placed on some things that we can do. So with that, I will entertain a motion, and then I'll make eye contact with Mr. Wright in case we need any help from him in terms of making it. But is there a motion from a member of the body?
Take a stab at it.
Thank you.
And it's a real stab. So I move to direct the administrator to secure outside sources or resources to support the requests made by the committee. I'm trying to be vague. Is that too vague?
No, I think that's the correct amount of vagueness.
Second.
And
It's been moved and properly seconded. Where was Mr. Wright when I was writing my college papers to say that was the appropriate level of vagueness? Is there any additional discussion? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Teratio,
Yes.
Barron,
yes,
English,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. And then just procedurally, Mr. Wright, so this motion will go to full council for approval for the complete authorization?
Correct.
Thank you. That brings us to item 5C. I move that the county adopt the 2021 Land Development Code text amendments and the zoning map recommended by the Planning Commission by unanimous vote on November 7th, 2022, to take effect on the effective date of the full 2021 Land Development Code text and associated maps. That motion was made by Councilman Branham, who has joined us today. And if it please the body, I would love to recognize Councilman Branham so he can address his motion for us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to remind everyone that the recommendations were set forth in the packet for a prior council meeting. And if you need to put your hands on them again, just let staff know. And if you'd like to go over those with me, I'm happy to go over them with you. I would encourage everyone to think about what's going on at this point in time with three different components. The first one being the base text, the base 2021 adopted text. The second component being the zoning map that needs to be adopted before anything can take effect. And the third component being any and all of the Planning Commission recommendations that council decides to adopt. And I will, again, call attention to the fact that one of the commission's recommendations as to the map is reliant on one of their recommendations to the text amendment, and that is that the M1 zoning district would carry forward from the old code and from the old zoning map to the new code and the new zoning map. I bring that up to say that the ideal is that all three of those components would take effect at the same time to whatever extent possible. And had a great meeting with the administrator, the county attorney, and Chairman Walker about the process, and that's what this is. This is a procedural comment. And so my motion was specifically worded out of the conversation with that group in the hopes that we could have the effective date of those three components be the same time, so that there was as much continuity and as little disruption as possible once the new map and the new text take effect.
Thank you. Any immediate questions for Mr. Branham? Ms. Barron?
I've got a couple. I've done my homework since our last meeting. Thank you, Mr. Branham, for a study session. And that kind of, I don't know which way it went, but it was all over the place, but it was good. It was helpful. And that is, one question that I have is, is that you're stating about the November 7th recommendations that came out of the commission's meeting. However, as I started doing some further digging, does the November 7th recommendations also include the motions that came through council from September? There was a number of them. Your predecessor put forth probably most, if not all. And so I think that when I started to look at the list and the information that's presenting, it appears that there are some motions that were not addressed by the commission that either existing council members or past council members had. And I would like to note that those items be addressed if they have not been.
Thank you, and Mr. Branham. If that's something you need to direct to staff, feel free.
Ms. Barron, do you have some of those motions to help me remember what they were?
I didn't jot them down specifically, but I was looking at notes, and I remember a meeting where there was a plethora of them, maybe 15 or 20 of them and I want, because we've had a lot of conversation about the November 7th meeting where there were lots of details, but somewhere along the line, the September meeting, we've not, I don't see the two lists matching up. And I just want to make sure that we've not lost some along the way.
Councilwoman Barron, Attorney Wright would like to address your question.
Right. I believe that there were certain motions that were made that were determined that they were improper motions. because I think at that point, part of the, I guess, seeming the purpose of the motion were to undo the vote that had taken place in November 2021, which at that point was past the point where that could be done. So those motions were not proper to go before the committee. So the motions that went to the planning commission were the motions that were proper motions. So I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, the motions you're referring to, why they weren't addressed is because they weren't legally appropriate to be addressed by the planning commission at that point in time.
And so if that is the case, is it how would council know that? Like, how would we know that those motions were improper and they didn't move on to the planning commission as stated from this body? How would we have known that? Or
Right, if my understanding, I think it was discussed and determined that they weren't proper, so they didn't move on from the full body.
from the full body?
Right.
So what I think I'll do, just so that I won't belabor the point, I will get the list of the questions, pull them, and have them specifically so that we can make sure that we are comparing apples with apples. But that was a concern that I did have. And another, if I may continue.
Please.
Another thing, and I've said this several times, and even to Mr. Brandon when we had our conversation, I'm concerned that when we start to pass all three of these at one time, and there are lots of things that we already know that we need to go back and fix, it seems like, why can't we fix them now and then have a solid document or documents and then vote on them? Because I'd like to trust the system to say that all these plethora of changes that need to take place will take place, but I don't want it to get lost. And I know for my district, this document is critically important. And so I can't support something that appears to be incomplete from the beginning. And to say that we're going to, let's just vote on it now, and then, we'll go back later and fix it. That's trusting that just like this morning, let me go on a tangent. I told my youngest son, Prez, I said, make sure you make up your bed before you leave. I walked down the stairs and went on about my business. I came back upstairs, and guess what? The bed was not made. I would like to trust that he's gonna do what I ask him to do. And I like to trust this system, but I'm concerned because of all of the roller coasters we've been through already. So I know we've had conversations that we can't split them up and they're married and all that. Do we have like state statute that says that we can't do that? Where are we going with this?
Mr. Wright, I see you chomping at the bit to answer Ms. Barron's question. Before you do, if I may, Ms. Barron, just for the benefit of everyone, because the Land Development Code is one of the most nuanced and complicated things that has come before me since I've been on council. And it's also, from the day I was elected, something that I've considered the most important thing that will come out of my time on council. So if I may paraphrase, just to ensure that, number one, I'm hearing your question correctly, so that when you get your answers, you get answered correctly, because you're not alone with your questions. So with that in mind, what I heard you say were fundamentally two separate questions. There was a question about process and order, which is, what do we have to do, in what order? Is it defined by state statute? Do we have to do it the way that we're going to do it? And then the other part of the question that I'm hearing is, regardless of what process that we use, how do we ensure that all of the recommendations and proposals are incorporated in the document that will come before us for a vote? Not trying to put words in your mouth, but want to understand, is that a correct separation of your two questions?
Yes,
Close enough for government work?
close enough.
All right, so with that, Mr. Wright, I will let you address any or all of those questions for Ms. Barron and the community.
Okay. First of all, state statute does require that this body redo the land development code every 10 years, at least every 10 years. And there's a specific process that has to be gone through, which includes the comprehensive plan. So that's,
Mr. Wright, I apologize, may I interrupt? It is my full understanding that we have to update the comprehensive plan every 10
Right.
years, but not the land development code,
Right,
because
the
our last
comprehensive-
one was 2006.
right, well, the land development code, the only way you can update it overall is through a comprehensive plan. So it's the same process. It's just the comprehensive plan has to be developed at least every 10 years.
Sure, I get,
And-
there's so much confusion when you say land development code, that if we just leave it, that you said that the land development code has to be updated every 10 years, I think that could potentially cause a lot of confusion. The comprehensive plan piece is required to be updated every 10 years, which is part of our planning
Land
process.
development code process.
Thank you.
Right. So, and what the county did is that they had a comprehensive plan. What came out of that was the vote of November 2021, where this body approved the text. It could have approved both the text and the maps because it's the same entity, the land development code. The one part is the text, one part is the maps. The purpose of the maps are to match the text. The text has been approved. It's been approved since November 2021. That's, at this point, is past the point where you can undo it. So it's set in stone. The text is set in stone. What we have to do at this point is approve the maps to match the text. Once you have the complete thing, you can make adjustments or amendments. So that's why you can't really make the amendments to the text before you do the maps, because the text has already been approved and has been approved for a year and a half, and you only have a certain amount of time where you can change that, and we're long past that time until we get the maps completed, because the maps and the text go together. They're one thing. The reason we've been operating under the 2005 code is because that's the interim procedure, but the 2021 code has been passed, and it was passed November 2021. So that's where it comes in that you can't really make amendments until you complete it. So you have to complete it, and then gets the maps in place, and then once you have both in place, and it's one solid document, then you can make amendments to make adjustments to the full thing. So the problem is that, I guess, when the body voted, it voted on the text and left the maps out there. And what the plan was for, I think it was voted on in November, the text. The maps were supposed to automatically take effect in May, but that process was halted. And so that's where we come in, where we are today, is it didn't change the fact that the text was approved in November. It's just the maps were halted, so that means we've been operating under interim procedures for the past year and a half. So until we get it completed, we can't make those amendments that are requested by the Planning Commission.
Ms. Barron, I just want to know, I'm sure you have a follow-up question, and I also want to acknowledge that Mr. Branham has some updates. So Ms. Barron, would you like to be recognized now or after Mr. Branham? Okay, Mr. Branham?
And Mr. Wright, just to confirm again, there is an opportunity for us to delay the effective date of the zoning map to give council an opportunity to review and vote on the Planning Commission's recommendations and then have them take effect simultaneously.
That's correct. What can be done is that the text is already in place. We have that. It's been approved for a year and a half. Once the maps are approved, we can delay the effective date of the new land development code, 2021 land development code. So because we're currently operating under the interim procedures, which is the 2005 land development code. So once we get the full entity, the code plus the maps passed by this body, the text plus the maps passed by this body, then we can say that the effective date won't be until, say, 90 days later. What that does is that gives the opportunity for the amendments to be considered by this body and go through the 3 readings that it must have. And by the time that those 3 readings are finished, in those 90 days, then both will take effect at the very exact same time, so there is no delay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Barron?
So I just want to make sure I'm clear. The recommendations that are being suggested in this motion from the Planning Commission is that those recommendations for that map matches the text that we voted on in 2021. Does that map match the text?
Madam Chair?
Right. That's not a Patrick Wright question.
No, it is not. Mr. Branham is asking to be recognized, and Mr. Brown, I just ask you have your staff on standby as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We're on standby.
I'm happy to defer to staff, but again, the one, it's like yes, but with one exception, and that is that the 2021 version of the text does not include a zoning district that is M1. And the Planning Commission's version of the zoning map includes parcels continuing to have the zoning label M1. And so that's the one exception where opt at least that one Planning Commission recommendation in order for that map to make sense.
Is there anything that staff would like to add?
No, ma'am.
Thank you. Ms. Barron, you're recognized.
Make sure I'm clear. And that is, so if that is the case, if there is an exception, then what we're doing is not what Mr. Wright has said that we need to do. And that's my challenge. My challenge is that on one hand, we're saying that we need to accept both of these documents together. Today, Mr. Wright has shared with us that the 2 documents must match. If they must match, then there can't be an exception. Help me understand why we're doing this. If the commission is asking for an exception, what you're asking for is something that we can't do.
Well, Councilman Livingston has arrived, and he's going to solve it for us. Just kidding.
And I know what y'all were talking about. I'll give you.
Don't do it. Don't jump in it.
But I know when to shut up too, though.
Is, Madam Councilwoman Barron, if I may, these are questions absolutely have to be answered. And again, this is.
I'm happy with offline. But I did exactly what I promised I would do. And that was to sit with the document a little bit longer. And so that's what I did. And so we're here today because of that. Feel free. You can send it to me after the meeting. Because I know we're getting ready for another meeting. But that's where I hang my hat on. I'm not going to vote for something. One hand you're telling me you can't do it, and then on the other hand you're saying, oh, please do it. It doesn't work. I'm done.
So are there any comments that you want to make before I try to circle this square?
No, that's not a legal question. The legal question is that you have the text, you have the maps, you put them together, that's the complete document. You can amend after that. That's the legal part.
Thank you. And I guess I'll just say for the benefit of the public, again, this process has been extremely convoluted. And for those of you who have been with us from day one, if there are questions that you have in your mind, I certainly understand why. And one of the challenges is that originally, when the code was passed in November 2021, the complete intention was that within a short amount of time, we would come back and put the maps together. But in response to an extreme outcry from the public for questions and considerations, we delayed that process. And because we delayed that process, we are in a bit of, Mr. Wright probably wouldn't call it a legal conundrum, because to him it's clear, but to the average person who doesn't have JD after their name, it just makes it a really strange process. So I want to acknowledge that. What my suggestion would be for this body or for this committee, if you think it is appropriate, is we understand that we have a lot of questions about the Land Development Code. And we're not remotely, well, I don't sense that we're ready to move this out of committee. However, like we do with other things, my suggestion would be, can we set a date determined where we say, council members, please sit with the document a little longer, submit all your questions to staff by this date, so that when we get together again, staff can bring those answers and we can have a fulsome conversation. Would that please the body? And if I make it one more recommendation, at our council meeting last, when we talked about communications, one of the things that I asked for, and it's probably not the first time in this process that I've asked for it, is we need to have frequently asked questions about this document. 80% of the people have the exact same questions, and in addition to us sitting with this document, which is long and complex, having that kind of document and guidance to provide a cheat sheet for us will help us to craft better questions and get better answers from staff. With that, I know it's 5:56. Ms. Barron wanted to make a comment, and so I'd like to acknowledge her.
I just want to go on the record that I've asked my questions, so I won't be submitting any in writing. I've asked them today.
Thank you. Are there any other comments for the good of the body before we adjourn and allow our A&F colleagues to assume their places? Then let's set a date offline for those questions. Madam Clerk, if you'll coordinate that, that brings us to item 6, the cheerful item known as adjournment.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Teratio,
Yes?
Barron,
Yes?
English,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes,
Motion approved.
thank you.